Okay, hello everyone. I am Bruce Shapiro. I'm the executive director of the Global Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is devoted both to ethical, effective, and innovative reporting on survivors of violence and abuse and crisis and tragedy, and also my subject today, our own well-being as journalists as we do that work. You're getting a lot of kind of whiz-bang PowerPoint presentations and videos. I want to have a conversation with you, so I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to limit it to words, and we'll see how we do. I'm going to begin by reading something here. I was fed up and bogged down. Of course, you say other people are too, and they keep going on. But if your job is to report on the war, you're very apt to begin writing unconscious distortions and unwarranted pessimisms when you get too tired. Personal weariness became a forest that shut off my view of the events around me. That was the American reporter Ernie Pyle. He was writing in 1943 about the impact of reporting on World War II, on his own life, on his mental health, we would say today, and also on his news judgment. Now, I'm a reporter, like so many of you here, and I think, like many of you here, I don't always know what that means. My friend Skip Isaacs, who was one of the great American journalists of the Vietnam era, defines a journalist as someone who finds stuff out and tells people about it. And that's good. But we are also, in the words of another friend, the great psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, who died earlier this month at age 99, witnessing professionals. Some of us in this room today witness mostly with data, some with images. Some report from the scene of war and demonstrations and climate disaster, and others, like Martha Mendoza, whose wonderful work we just heard about, buried deeply into archives and investigative projects and testimony. Some of us are reporting in the communities in which we grew up and live. Some are in exile because of work many of us have endured at one time or another, threat or harassment or abuse. But all of us in this room, in one way or another, bear witness to the lives and experiences of others. All of us carry on our own souls and are at once motivated and burdened by our encounters with individuals who have themselves survived grief, displacement, abuse, violence, whether in the home, the street, or in war. All of us are here because we feel an ethical pull to defend the factuality of those experiences, to bring lucidity to public debate about them and accountability to abusers of power, and we believe in the possibility of civil society informed by empathetic engagement. What it all boils down to is that as journalists, we tend to think of ourselves as being there for other people. That's certainly true of me. But I'm here with a simple proposition. If we want to be there for other people, we also need to be here as witnessing professionals for ourselves. In particular, we need to recognize and acknowledge, as Ernie Pyle hinted all those years ago, that our own individual and collective psychological well-being as journalists is integral to high-impact work and to press freedom itself. Now, tomorrow, my wonderful colleague, Dr. Kate Porterfield, an actual psychologist, will lead a workshop on coping with stress and trauma. It will be very practical. You will learn wonderful things. I urge you to go. Today, I'm going to do something different. I want to propose a framework for placing self-care, looking after colleagues, and the news industry's duty of care at the very top of our professional practice and the center of the press freedom agenda. To justify this, let me start with a few things that we know from 25 years of research. First of all, we know that journalism is, and I hate to break this to you, it has been and always will be a high-stress profession, right? All of us are here because we are hopeless stress monkeys. We have all gone into a profession driven by deadlines, by sources that are constantly changing, by people who are going to hate us a certain amount of the time for what we report. We are all good at mobilizing our internal resources in the face of high demand. You are all Olympic athletes of stress. But we know that open-ended, unremitting stress at a very high level, when the demands of reporting and editing and producing routinely exceed the resources available to do that, there can be a radical loss of professional efficacy. And that is burnout. And in our profession, we're talking about burnout a lot these days. Burnout is not just a synonym for being extra tired. It is an occupational injury, a condition defined by the World Health Organization. And many of the clinicians we work with believe that burnout is a higher occupational health and safety risk for journalists than it's ever been because of the pace of the news cycle, the huge stakes and huge demands of our work in the last several years. We also know from 25 years of studies that we in journalism work in a trauma-facing profession. Now, this may sound obvious, but that can take a toll. Depending on the study, between 85 and 100% of journalists at every stage of our careers and on every beat are exposed to major traumatic events on the job. And that can take a toll. And I'm not just talking about war and disaster. We also know about the work from brain scientists that the basic mechanisms of traumatic stress can damage the very qualities we rely on in journalism. Concentration, focus, presence in the moment can be thrown out of kilter biologically. News judgment and meaning-making can be distorted, as Ernie Pyle describes. Our ability to forge trusting relationships with sources, colleagues, and news consumers can be corroded when we've absorbed too much threat and too much violence. But the same 25 years of studies tell us something else, that journalists are resilient professionals. We don't need to be scared of trauma, right? The very job which exposes us to trauma and stress also includes well-established resilience factors. Having a job to do in the face of mayhem, having craft skills that give us agency and control, having ethics, having trusted colleagues. All of these are established buffers against the impact of stress and trauma, and that's good because it means we can lean into what we already know how to do as one of the very best mechanisms for pushing back against the impact of psychological injury in our profession. All of this creates, I think, a very powerful imperative to action. A journalist who is sidelined by burnout, a journalist who's unable to meet a deadline because of occupational PTSD, is silenced as effectively and thoroughly as if imprisoned. Now, happily, the news industry, after years of silence and stigma, is beginning to recognize this reality. Thanks in part to some of the research I've just described, but thanks also to many young journalists, many unions that are all beginning to push for greater duty of care in the news industry. Now, newsrooms around the world are beginning to include trauma awareness training for reporters and editors and managers. Some are developing peer support schemes. We know that trusting collegial support is the most important element in journalist resilience. There are more newsrooms willing to get proper psychological help for journalists when they need it, and groups like Committee to Protect Journalists, with which we work closely as our fiscal sponsor, the International Women's Media Foundation, RSF, the Rory Peck Trust, all are providing funding for psychological support for journalists when they need it. But so much more needs to be done. Corporations, news companies need to include psychological sustainability in their strategic planning. Companies need to train managers, interrogate workflows, coming up with creative strategies, especially for dealing with graphic imagery, a major problem. The press freedom community needs to recognize journalists' mental health as an urgent priority, not just when people are pushed over the edge, but to prevent it from happening in the first place. There's also another more personal level to all of this, more personal to me anyway. Now we are reporting so much amid a pervasive violation of basic democratic values and decency, what my friend Robert J. Lifton once called malignant normality, which he defined as society's routinization of falsehood and destructive behavior. This shift, Lifton said, can produce psychic numbing, the inability or disinclination to feel, which can reach the point of immobilization. What people sometimes call news avoidance, there was a big argument about that last night, is, I think, just one symptom of that immobilization, that disengagement, that malignant normality. And malignant normality is a tough environment for reporting. We may get exhausted by the ongoing pervasive lies and abuses and violations that seem only to escalate in the face of our reporting. We are uncertain about the impact of our work. There may be violations by media owners or institutions themselves. A sense, whether it's about Gaza, climate, autocracy, whether media itself becomes part of the malignant normality problem. Another one of my mentors, Dr. Jonathan Shea, reached back to this city, ancient Athens, to describe what happens when our own profession betrays values at a high-stakes time. He looked at the Iliad, at Achilles' rage at Agamemnon, his general, for betraying him, and Shea called this moral injury. He used it to describe soldiers caught up in atrocities. Others have extended that language to describe enduring the psychological impact of perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent a gross violation of deeply held values. And many of us as journalists now experience some moments or enduring sense of that in the course of our work. Now, moral injury is not a diagnosis, but it's like throwing gasoline on the flames of trauma, burnout, and other psychological distress. And that makes it a threat, not just to individual journalists' well-being, but to the journalism community itself, to press freedom itself. And like traumatic stress and burnout, moral injury is not a doom, it is not a fate, it is preventable. And the answer begins not with therapy, actually, but with ethics. With recognizing that ethics are what make journalism journalism. That doesn't mean some frozen rule book, but it does mean arguing and doubling down on what ethical news practice in the face of trauma and autocracy and violence means, and recognizing that the argument itself is crucial not only to our work, but to our collective resilience. It means recognizing that the ecology of the newsroom matters. We can't be covering violation out there in the real world and come back to a newsroom that is a hostile environment where racism or gender inequity or manager abuse or other things exist. And finally, on here I speak a little bit as a historian of journalism too. When journalism is inadequate or feels inadequate to the depth of violation around us, the way to prevent moral injury is to refuse immobilization. It's to take action, to innovate, as all of you are doing this week here at this wonderful conference. My friend Robert J. Lifton again said last year, before he died, to cope with the catastrophe of a second Trump administration and to counter the serial lying, we need to use every imaginable means of truth-telling, and truth-telling itself becomes an expression of activist resistance. Journalism itself, as nonviolent civil resistance, is what all of you do in your work, and it's why mental health and professional ethics and press freedom are one interwoven, inextricable fabric. And I ended on 0-0. Do I have time for a question or two, or? Okay. Okay. Thank you all. What? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Okay.
Thank you for this. So, do you feel like that there is a chance that we might do better with mental health in the future? Because you spoke also about the climate within the business model also. Yeah. Can we do better, or are you a little bit optimistic that the younger among us that will, that they are aspiring journalists will have better mental health than us, let's say?
Oh, I feel very optimistic about this despite the challenge. First of all, over the course of the last decade or so, there has already been so much progress in what we know, first of all, the kinds of research that some of my psychologist friends have done on our profession, but also in the way that newsrooms have grappled with it. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation established a peer support network. So does Reuters, Washington Post, some other places. Through the Global Center for Journalism and Trauma, we are training psychotherapists in news culture. But I think the most important source of optimism for me are younger colleagues who I see in newsrooms all over the world pushing their bosses for greater duty of care, for attention to the well-being. And sometimes there's a little bit of a generational conflict. You will get older managers who don't have a language for mental health. They may care, but we grew up in newsrooms where there was stigma or where you just didn't talk about it, and it can get confusing sometimes. But I'm finding that we're in a period of profound culture change in newsrooms all over the world, being driven in part by the people who are today's new journalists, today's students, and by a growing number of newsroom leaders and managers who are hearing it, taking it seriously, and are trying to find ways without compromising news practice to invest. And again, I view standards and excellence in news practice and the deepest kind of ethics, especially for reporting on traumatized people and situations like Gaza or Ukraine, or issues like intimate partner violence or children, as part of the mental health equation. When you do great reporting, you're also creating greater resilience within the journalism community. So the two, to me, are tied together. Does that make any sense?